What if the greatest enemy standing between you and success is not the world, but a voice inside your own mind that you have never questioned? Stay with me until the end, because by the final moments of this speech, you will understand why most people never succeed, not because they lack talent, but because they are possessed by their own unconscious patterns, and how you can take control of them. Every day you wake up believing you are in control of your life. Yet most of your decisions, your fears, habits, procrastination, self-doubt, are made long before you are conscious of them. There is a silent architect inside you. It designs your destiny while you believe you are merely reacting to circumstances. If you leave this speech early, you will return to the same invisible prison. But if you stay until the end, you will learn how to turn the mind from a master into a servant. And that is the beginning of true success. Most people believe their lives are shaped by external circumstances, money, opportunities, education, luck, but long before any of these forces act upon them, a quieter power has already decided the direction. This power does not shout. It whispers. It appears as a familiar inner voice that feels so intimate, so natural, that it is rarely questioned. From the moment you wake up, this voice interprets the world for you. It tells you what is possible, what is dangerous, what is worth attempting, and what must be avoided. You trust it because you think it is you. Yet this is where the first illusion begins. The mind you experience is not a unified commander. It is a battlefield of impulses, memories, fears, and inherited beliefs, many of which were formed before you ever learned to think critically. Success, failure, confidence, hesitation, all of these are first decided internally, long before they become visible in action. There is an unseen struggle taking place within every individual. On the surface, a person may appear calm, decisive, or ambitious, but beneath that surface lie unresolved conflicts that quietly shape behavior. A desire to move forward clashes with a fear of loss. The urge to create battles the need for approval. The wish to become more is restrained by the comfort of what is already familiar. This struggle is not dramatic, it is subtle, repetitive, and exhausting. Because it happens internally, it often goes unnoticed. People call it procrastination, lack of discipline, or bad habits, without realizing these are merely symptoms. The true conflict lies deeper, in the unexamined assumptions that govern thought. Until these assumptions are brought into awareness, the mind operates on autopilot, repeating patterns that feel inevitable but are not. The tragedy is that most people never question the source of their thoughts. A thought appears, and it is immediately believed. I am not ready. This is too risky. People like me do not succeed. These sentences arise spontaneously, carrying emotional weight, and because they feel personal, they are treated as truth. Yet many of these thoughts were planted long ago, by authority figures, cultural expectations, moments of failure, or emotional pain. They are not conclusions reached through reason, they are echoes. The mind, left unchecked, becomes a museum of past experiences, and the individual lives as a caretaker of outdated exhibits. In such a state, success feels distant, not because it is unreachable, but because the mind is occupied with preserving the familiar rather than exploring the possible. What makes this inner battle so powerful is that it is invisible. External obstacles can be confronted, strategized against, and overcome. Internal obstacles disguise themselves as common sense. They wear the mask of realism. They convince you that hesitation is wisdom and that fear is caution. Over time, this leads to a life that feels smaller than it could be, yet strangely safe. The mind prefers predictability over growth, even when predictability leads to dissatisfaction. This is why people often sabotage opportunities that could change their lives, not consciously but through hesitation, delay, or self-doubt that feels justified. The mind protects its existing structure, even at the cost of fulfillment. To understand this is to realize that controlling the mind is not about forcing positive thoughts or silencing negativity. It is about recognizing that the mind is a system shaped by layers of experience. Some layers are conscious, but many are not. These unconscious layers influence perception, attention, and reaction. They decide what you notice and what you ignore. They filter reality. Two people can face the same situation, and one sees a threat while the other sees an opportunity. The difference is not intelligence or talent, but the inner framework through which reality is interpreted. That framework, unless examined, remains invisible to the person living inside it. The mind you think you control is in many ways controlling you. It decides which ideas feel exciting and which feel impossible. It determines how long you persist in difficulty and how quickly you retreat. It influences your body, your energy, and even your posture. When the mind is dominated by unresolved fear or contradiction, the body follows. Tension becomes normal, restlessness becomes routine, distraction becomes a refuge. People seek motivation, not realizing that motivation fails when the mind itself is divided. A divided mind cannot sustain effort because part of it is always pulling in the opposite direction. Within this divided mind lie forces that are rarely acknowledged. There is the part that wants recognition without responsibility, the part that desires success without sacrifice, the part that dreams of change but fears isolation or failure. These parts are not enemies, they are expressions of survival instincts that once served a purpose. The problem arises when they remain unconscious. When ignored, they do not disappear. They influence decisions indirectly, often undermining long-term goals in favor of short-term relief. A person may consciously desire success, yet unconsciously fear the identity change that success demands. This inner contradiction drains energy and creates confusion. What you do not understand within yourself, you project onto the world. Resistance becomes bad timing, fear becomes lack of opportunity, inner conflict becomes external pressure. In this way, the mind protects itself from examination by shifting responsibility outward. This is comforting because it relieves the individual from confronting uncomfortable truths, but it also locks them into repetition. The same patterns appear in different forms, different jobs, different relationships, different goals, yet the same frustrations. The mind recreates familiar emotional landscapes because they feel known, even when they are painful. The first step toward controlling the mind is realizing that it is not a single voice with a single intention. It is a dialogue, sometimes a debate, sometimes a conflict. Some parts of you are aligned with growth, while others are aligned with preservation. Neither is wrong, but only one can lead. When preservation dominates, life becomes defensive. When growth dominates without awareness, life becomes chaotic. Balance is not achieved by suppressing one side, but by understanding both. Awareness, NG's the relationship. Instead of being possessed by thoughts, you begin to witness them. Instead of obeying every impulse, you begin to question its origin. As awareness grows, the hidden forces lose their grip. Fear, once unnamed, becomes specific. Resistance, once overwhelming, becomes understandable. You begin to notice patterns, the thoughts that arise before avoidance, the emotions that surface before distraction, the stories you tell yourself before retreating. These observations are not judgments, they are revelations. With each revelation, a small amount of freedom is gained. The mind begins to loosen its automatic control, not because it is being fought, but because it is being seen. And what is seen clearly can no longer rule from the shadows. As awareness deepens, something uncomfortable begins to happen. The mind, once perceived as a helpful guide, reveals its hidden tensions. Thoughts no longer appear as neutral suggestions, but as expressions of conflicting inner forces. One moment urges movement, ambition, and risk, while another pulls toward safety, familiarity, and withdrawal. This inner division is not a flaw. It is the natural consequence of a psyche shaped by both survival and aspiration. Yet when these forces remain unconscious, they create paralysis. A person stands still not because they lack ability, but because opposing currents within them cancel each other out. Progress requires energy, and divided energy produces exhaustion rather than movement. Most people attempt to solve this exhaustion externally. They search for discipline, motivation, or systems to force consistency. But discipline imposed on an unexamined mind becomes fragile. It works for a short time, then collapses under the weight of inner resistance. The part of the mind that fears change quietly undermines effort, creating rational excuses that sound reasonable and responsible. The person believes they are thinking clearly, when in reality they are negotiating with their own fear. This is why progress often feels like pushing against an invisible wall. The wall is not the world, it is the unacknowledged parts of the self pulling in the opposite direction. Within every individual exists a shadowed region of the psyche that contains rejected traits, uncomfortable emotions, and unfulfilled desires. These aspects are not inherently negative, but they conflict with the image a person has built of who they believe they should be. Instead of being integrated, they are pushed away. The mind convinces itself that these traits do not exist, yet they continue to influence behavior indirectly. Repressed anger turns into passive resistance. Unacknowledged ambition turns into resentment. Denied vulnerability turns into emotional distance. The more intensely these parts are suppressed, the more powerfully they act from beneath awareness. The path forward does not begin with elimination, but with recognition. When a person dares to observe their own reactions honestly, patterns emerge. The same situations trigger the same emotions. The same fears appear at the edge of every meaningful opportunity. This repetition is not coincidence, it is the psyche demanding attention. Growth is not blocked by ignorance but by avoidance. The mind protects itself from discomfort by distracting, rationalizing, and postponing. These defenses feel natural because they have been practiced for years. Yet the moment they are noticed, their power weakens. The mind can no longer pretend unity when its contradictions are visible. There comes a point in this process where observation alone is no longer comfortable. Awareness sharpens perception, and with it comes the realization that many limitations are self-created. This is the moment most people retreat. It is easier to believe that circumstances are unfair than to accept that fear has been guiding decisions. But those who continue face an internal threshold. They encounter aspects of themselves they would rather not see, insecurity masked as pride, laziness disguised as patience, fear disguised as logic. This confrontation is unsettling because it dismantles familiar self-images. The mind resists, not because it is malicious, but because identity feels threatened. This inner confrontation marks a critical turning point. It is no longer a theoretical exploration of thought patterns, but a lived experience of inner conflict. Old habits begin to feel hollow. Excuses lose their emotional force. Attention arises bet. Wean who a person has been and who they sense they could become. This tension is not a problem to be solved, but a signal of transformation. When ignored, it leads to stagnation. When faced, it initiates change. The discomfort is the cost of honesty, and honesty is the price of control. Without it, the mind remains fragmented and success remains accidental. At the peak of this confrontation, a choice presents itself. Not a dramatic decision, but a quiet internal shift. The individual can either retreat into familiar patterns or remain present with discomfort. Remaining present means allowing fear, doubt, and resistance to exist without acting on them. This is where true power emerges. The mind is accustomed to immediate reaction. It wants relief, distraction, or reassurance. When none are provided, something unexpected happens. The intensity diminishes, the emotion reveals its temporary nature, the thought loses its authority. In this space, a person discovers that they are not their thoughts, but the awareness observing them. This realization changes the internal hierarchy. Thoughts no longer command, they advise. Emotions no longer dictate, they inform. The mind, once a chaotic assembly of competing impulses, begins to organize itself around a conscious center. This does not mean fear disappears or that doubt is eliminated. It means they no longer control behavior. Action becomes a deliberate choice rather than a reaction. The individual starts to move forward not because they feel confident, but because confidence is no longer a prerequisite. Responsibility replaces hope. Consistency replaces intensity. The inner world becomes quieter, not because it is suppressed, but because it is understood. As this integration takes place, energy previously consumed by inner conflict becomes available for creation. Focus increases because fewer internal arguments compete for attention. Decisions become clearer because they are not filtered through layers of fear. The mind begins to function as an instrument rather than an obstacle. This shift is subtle but profound. External circumstances may not change immediately, but the individual's relationship to them does. Challenges are no longer interpreted as threats to identity, but as situations requiring response. Failure loses its emotional charge. Success loses its intoxicating effect. Both become information rather than judgment. The climax of this inner process is not a moment of triumph but of clarity. The person sees their own patterns without distortion. They recognize how fear once disguised itself as wisdom, and how avoidance once masqueraded as patience. This clarity does not produce pride, it produces humility. There is an understanding that the mind is neither enemy nor savior, but a tool shaped by experience. Left unconscious, it controls. Made conscious, it serves. This realization marks the transition from inner fragmentation to inner alignment, where actions arise from intention rather than company. Impulsion and effort is no longer wasted in internal resistance. When the inner world begins to align, the effects appear quietly but unmistakably. There is a sense of stability that does not depend on circumstances. External success or failure no longer shakes the core of the individual, because the source of direction has shifted inward. The mind, once fragmented by competing impulses, now moves with a unified intention. This unity does not eliminate difficulty, it changes how difficulty is experienced. Challenges are met without the internal collapse that once accompanied them. Effort no longer feels like self-betrayal, and persistence no longer requires constant emotional reinforcement. As this integration deepens, the individual notices a change in how time and energy are used. Distraction loses its appeal because it no longer provides escape from inner conflict. Focus emerges naturally, not as an act of force, but as a byproduct of clarity. Tasks that once felt heavy become manageable, and complex problems are approached with patience rather than urgency. The mind learns to remain present, responding to what is in front of it instead of reacting to imagined futures or unresolved pasts. This presence creates a sense of momentum that feels steady rather than frantic. Success in this state is no longer driven by the need to prove worth or escape inadequacy. It becomes an expression of alignment between intention and action. Goals are pursued with consistency because they are no longer sabotaged by unconscious resistance. The individual understands that setbacks are not signs of failure but necessary points of feedback. Each obstacle reveals something about method, timing, or understanding. The emotional charge attached to outcomes diminishes, allowing clearer evaluation and adjustment. This emotional neutrality does not imply indifference, it reflects maturity. The person remains engaged without being consumed. With this shift comes a new relationship to fear. Fear is no longer interpreted as a signal to stop, but as information indicating where growth is required. Instead of avoiding discomfort, the individual learns to move toward it deliberately. This does not mean recklessness, it means conscious exposure. By repeatedly acting in alignment with intention despite internal resistance, the mind rewires its expectations. What once triggered paralysis now triggers alertness. Confidence emerges not from success alone, but from the repeated experience of acting without being controlled by fear. As control over the mind increases, so does responsibility. The individual can no longer attribute stagnation to confusion or lack of motivation. Clarity brings accountability. Choices are seen for what they are, and avoidance becomes difficult to justify. This responsibility is not a burden, it is liberating. It removes the need for external validation and approval. Decisions are guided by inner coherence rather than social comparison. The individual becomes less reactive to praise and criticism alike, understanding that both are transient and often unrelated to truth. To sustain this state, the mind requires structure, not rigid control, but intentional order. Daily observation becomes a practice rather than an occasional insight. Thoughts are noticed before they become actions. Emotional reactions are felt without immediate expression. This creates a space between stimulus and response where choice resides. Within this space, habits are formed deliberately. Routines are designed not to suppress spontaneity, but to support consistency. The mind thrives when it knows what is expected of it. Chaos breeds reactivity. Structure fosters freedom. Rituals play a crucial role in maintaining inner alignment. Simple, repeated actions anchor attention and reinforce intention. They signal to the mind that certain values are non-negotiable. Whether it is reflection, physical discipline, creative work, or silence, these rituals create continuity. They remind the individual of direction when motivation fades. Over time, they shape identity. A person does not become disciplined by force, but by repetition. Each small conscious act strengthens the relationship between intention and behavior. Equally important is the practice of honest self-examination. Not in the form of self-criticism, but inquiry. When resistance appears, it is explored rather than judged. When avoidance arises, it is traced to its source. This curiosity prevents unconscious patterns from regaining control. The mind is dynamic, it continuously adapts. Without ongoing awareness, old habits can return under new disguises. Regular reflection keeps the inner landscape familiar, reducing the likelihood of being surprised by one's own behavior. As this approach continues, a subtle transformation occurs in how the individual relates to others. Projection decreases. The tendency to blame, idealize, or resent fades as inner conflicts are resolved. Interactions become clearer because they are no longer clouded by unmet inner needs. Boundaries strengthen naturally. The individual knows when to engage and when to withdraw, not out of fear but discernment. This clarity extends to work, relationships, and ambition. Choices are made with long-term coherence in mind rather than short-term emotional relief. The disciplined mind does not seek constant stimulation. It values depth over novelty. It recognizes that mastery requires repetition and patience. This understanding reduces impulsivity. Decisions are made with consideration rather than urgency. The individual becomes capable of sustained effort without burning out because effort is no longer driven by inner conflict. Energy is conserved and directed. Rest becomes intentional rather than escapist. Action becomes purposeful rather than compulsive. Over time, this approach reshapes identity. The person no longer defines themselves by fluctuating emotions or passing thoughts. Identity becomes rooted in values and chosen direction. This stability allows for flexibility. When circumstances change, the individual adapts without losing coherence. The mind remains responsive rather than reactive. This is the essence of control, not dominance over thought, but partnership with it. The mind offers possibilities, consciousness chooses direction. In this partnership, success is not a distant outcome but a continuous process of alignment between inner order and outer action. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. But when you take responsibility for your inner world, the outer world begins to change. Success is not achieved by conquering others. It is achieved by confronting yourself.